9 years ago, I was on a bumpy bus ride to rural India, to a small little village. And on the bus, I chanced upon a conversation with a boy who happened to be from this village. And he started talking to me about the many things he aimed to achieve in life by moving from the village to the city. And I found that rather interesting. I decided to question his motives a bit more. What was it that was really propelling him to sort of move to the city? At which point he turned and told me that he didn't want to do what his parents did, which was farming and agriculture. And I found this really ironic because I was in a very similar position to him. I too was leaving home and looking for greener pastures. But I was moving from the city to the village and I was going to study about agriculture. So how did I really get to this point? Well, I wasn't raised on a farm. I grew up in one of the biggest cities in the world, Mumbai, or as I more fondly remember it, Bombay. And it's the kind of city where you don't really have farms, there are just factories. There's no rivers or water bodies or ponds, there's just tap water. And there's definitely no jungles, there are only concrete ones. And my story really starts in my mom's kitchen. And as a child, I was always enthralled by my mom's culinary skills. I would really spend days with her in the kitchen, helping her out whenever I could, really doing my 50 cents contribution towards her kitchen. I'm not sure if it was a good thing or a bad thing. Sometimes she'd just give me that real stare, like, what are you up to? Like, move out. But I developed this interest in food and gastronomy. And there comes a point in time in life when you have to choose a career path. And I decided to make hobby into profession. And that's when I graduated from a culinary school and I went on to joining this world of kitchens, chefs, flavors, and food. But somewhere in my learning curve, I took a deeper interest in really understanding food on a more fundamental level. There were a lot of questions toying in my head, like, why is it that food just doesn't have this functional quality of nourishing our lives, but also has this aspect of taste, and gives us so much pleasure through it? Why was it that, it's estimated an average Indian plate can host up to 30 ingredients? That's 30 species, different species coming together and harmoniously blending to make one delicious dish. How did that all work together? Where were these ingredients coming from? How were they grown? All these questions made me realize that I need to get to the real roots of things. And if I have to get to the roots of it all, I have to start with food production and agriculture. And that's when I decided at 20 to volunteer with a grassroots organization called Navdanya in India, to do a bit of documenting of some of the farming practices that farmers were engaged with. And so I set out and I went and I started studying some of the work that they were doing. And everything from simple organic manure systems all the way to how they were saving seeds. And I really started to understand that actually agriculture involves a lot more than just the basic idea of what you thought a seed went into the ground and a plant came up. And while I was learning all of this, I also started noticing how young people are completely disenchanted by the idea of agriculture. I had to think a lot about this boy I met on the bus, and I started understanding how there were so many young people out there who just completely didn't like the idea of agriculture and wanted to look for something new. I wanted to build on my own skills at the same time and understand a little more about food and how it's produced. And that's when I was very fortunate to take my passion to a school where I was awarded a scholarship. And the school is called the University of Gastronomic Sciences, and it's right here in Italy. And the school has this philosophy that books can teach you, but they can teach you only so much. And if you really want to learn about food and agriculture, you need to interact with some of these actors. And so I spend my time there really talking with indigenous peoples, talking with farmers, small-scale producers, fisher folk, academics as well, cooks. And one of the things that they all seem to resonate with, an idea, is that food is really an expression of our identity. It's an expression of our landscapes, and it's an expression of the biodiversity that's on these landscapes. And I was really amazed by some of this that I saw. But within this same idea of talking to them, the same context and framework, they very much acknowledge that we are concerned about the young people of tomorrow and how much they will take these values forward, particularly in a modern changing food system, which they acknowledge is not just having an impact on our ecosystems, but also on our health. And so, swiveled by some of these concerning issues, I graduated from the school. And that's when I had another avenue of opportunity, and there was a small group of communities from the northeast of India. And for those of you who don't know the northeast of India, there are 2 points to remember. One, it's a biological hotspot. And two, it's basically home to 250 plus indigenous tribes. So you can already kind of imagine the biocultural richness that exists in this region. And they were seeking for help because they had two major concerns on their young people. They felt that young people were not moving away from their traditional diets and changing their consumption patterns. And they also felt that young people were not taking up their traditional knowledge, their practices, and their skills, so more on a production side. And we wanted to address some of these issues, so we sat down together with these communities, and we asked them, well, what is the first thing that you'd like to do with this indigenous network? And they mentioned that millet is something that has been central to our diets. It's been central to our food systems. But we'd like to revive it. And so we went down to the communities and we said, okay, well, let's talk to some of these young people and find out really what's the problem with millet. And when you talk to these youth, they tell you that, we just completely dislike the taste of millet. It tastes horrible. And I tried some myself, and I was like, oh, yeah, that's for sure. It's, we could do better. And this is really food for thought for us, because very often we tend to be, oriented in a way where we say, millet is really something that's nutritionally high. It's a climate-smart crop. But what's the point of producing it if nobody's going to consume it? If really the taste is so bad that people, change their whole preferences and food preferences. And so what we started was something called the Cooks Alliance, which is really a network of young chefs together with rural cooks who came together to try and see how they could fuse modern sort of ideas together with traditional practices, in building some of the flavors of some of these crops and what is the potential of these neglected and underutilized species, such as millet. So the first idea that came out was, let's build a millet pancake. And everyone was like, okay, that's nice. And then someone's added the idea of, said, let's stuff it with local bananas. And then someone said, let's drizzle some local honey over it. And before you knew it, we had these millet banana pancakes like the ones you see here. And we went back to these communities that we were working in, and we said, let's try this with some of the students in some of these schools. And they started tasting some of this, and the tables turned immediately. I mean, forget being averse to the idea of millet. They started demanding this back. So much so that, following our first year of introducing the small little millet banana pancakes, we saw a 25% increase in the amount of millet production. So these were simple ways of looking at food as an entry point, really, into how we can change our food systems. But our work with taste is so much broader. And, like I was mentioning earlier, taste plays such an important role in how we look at food. And so we were really keen to sort of show people how taste can link to biodiversity. And what we would do is we'd organize these things called taste workshops. And taste workshops is really a sensory evaluation of foods and crops and foods from the forest. And to give you an example of this, we'd start off with putting, I'd like to exemplify this actually with honey, which is a really good one. We'd buy a very big brand of honey, which is a real standardized, homogenized product. You'd find it all over India, and it's literally a copy-paste version of that product. And we place it right in the center. And around it, we take honey from different villages, and we'd sort of put it as a little satellite around this honey. And then we'd start off with our sensory evaluation by first just looking at the color. And immediately you start to notice that, there's really distinctions in just the color of all these different honeys. Then we look at things like the viscosity of these different honeys. And finally, we'd get them to do a tasting where they would really start to understand how each of these honeys have their own diverse culinary aspects. They have their diverse medicinal uses, and they have diverse tastes. But obviously, the idea was to show them that all that honey is really dependent on the different flora that's around these villages. So immediately, they started to make the connect with the importance of biodiversity. But our work was not just on a consumption angle. We also wanted to look at production and how do we really, get young people back into agriculture and let them start appreciating it. And we really wanted to start with young children because we felt that if we could cultivate this interest with young children, we had a better chance of sort of getting engaged back in agriculture. And that's when we started this idea of school gardens. And school gardens was a fun and engaging way a practical way of hands-on sort of move out of the classroom, but still learn about the ideas of biodiversity, the ideas of agriculture, all through what traditional farmers have practiced for a really long time, and see how they could start learning in a very hands-on fashion. We didn't fathom this at first, but the impact was far wider than we thought it would be, because this school garden ended up complementing a lot of their midday meal, and the foods that they were eating in there, and giving them access to fresh vegetables, and that were not just fresh, but also nourishing. And in many ways, we were still not happy with the idea, especially when we talk about indigenous people, the idea of just simply production and cultivation of foods. We wanted to really ensure this knowledge was being transferred, even in the case of wild edibles. And so that's when we came up with an idea to have something called biodiversity walks, which was really taking the elderly of the village together with the youth into the forest on these excursions to try and show them what some of these wild foods have been about. What are the culinary uses? What are their medicinal uses? And the elderly would start sort of teaching a lot of these values, a lot of the uses to these young people. And what happened was, eventually they would come back and they'd have a little celebration with some of these forage foods. But this also ended up being a platform where we could document a lot of this biodiversity, not just for ourselves, but also for the communities, so that that knowledge stays in the community, thereby ensuring its generational passage. The last 9 years has really shown me that food is really central to our lives, to our ways of living. And in many ways, it's really propelled this idea of biological and cultural diversity. And I think in many ways today we've come to a modern context where we seem to be challenging that a little bit. We seem to be almost more productivity driven. And I think the idea and the role that young people play is really important. There's no point even using the word sustainable or future if we're not going to involve them. And in building these sustainable food systems, we need to try and ensure that we don't just take into consideration the ideas of what young people want to achieve in life, but we do it in a way that really encompasses the people, the planet, the plate, and the culture. So on that note, I'd just like to say thank you very much.